Let me put it again in context for Eastern Ontario. There are probably a half a dozen, let's call them relatively well-dated sites. A half a dozen sites spread over potentially 9,000 years.
Are you saying this is one of those?
Yeah.
Today we're conducting a stage 4 mitigation, meaning a removal of an archaeological site on a property that will be used for housing development. Well, what happened is that when we were brought to this site, and this site is actually all the fields you see behind me, behind the camera, there's vast fields, we were asked to do a stage 2 survey. So what we did is we had the fields plowed, and then we walked the fields looking for artifacts. We didn't find any. Then in the areas around these hills and in the forests, we did what's called test pitting, where you dig a hole about this big around and that deep, and then you look for artifacts. And in this area and the area down the hill you can't see from here, we found artifacts.
What was the first clue that there was something going on here?
Well, it was actually up here where we dug some test pits, and it was just over there. One of our crew, Kelly, she pulled out what looked like a clear piece of glass at first glance, but when we looked at it closely, it was actually crystal quartz, and it's what we call an end scraper. I don't have the crystal one on me, but I do have, I'll just show you one made of chert. And basically it looks like a round piece of stone like this, and it's got a nice little chipped edge. And when we saw this, I went, that's a tool. And I also know, because in archaeology we know about the early archaic, middle archaic period, many thousands of years of age, end scrapers are very common. And so when I saw that, that got me excited. When I started seeing a lot of quartz flakes, a lot of chipped stone in the other test pits, I started saying something's going on here. Enough that we could say we better do a stage 3. And the river that's over there is the South Nation River, and that has been a noted trade route for thousands of years between the Ottawa River and the St. Lawrence River for Aboriginal peoples. So it's not surprising that there is native material here. What we're seeing is multiple levels of occupation, meaning in the ground over time we're seeing the flakes of stone, occasional tools over time. So it shows they're coming back to the same place again and again. And it's a nice spot, so it's not surprising they would have. We're also seeing that they're doing a lot of making of tools here, because they're leaving many, many hundreds of flakes, but not a lot of tools. So it's showing that they're making things, leaving the waste, and then moving on. So that's what it's telling us right now. It's probably a temporary hunting, skinning camp. We don't see any evidence of permanent habitation. There's no houses, no post molds, no big fires, nothing like that. So it just shows they're coming, staying briefly, and then moving on. That's what we can tell right now. So that's what it's telling us right now. It was probably between, from what we can see, probably the early to late archaic periods. So anywhere from about 9,000 years ago to about 3,500 years ago. And it seems to be that time. And the reason we know it's archaic is because we're not finding any pottery. If we found pottery, it would be the later period known as the woodland period. We haven't found any of that yet. We do find a little bit of historic material in the upper layers, you know, rusty old nails, bits of broken historic pottery. But the rest of the material culture, 99% of it is this archaic period material. But it's a rough guess of where it is. I can't say for sure. We don't have radiocarbon dates, and we don't have particularly diagnostic artifacts at this site. We found 95% of the material found in the lower site is quartz. So it's dark quartz, it's reddish, pinkish quartz, white quartz, clear quartz. Some of the more interesting pieces we found on the lower site, we found some chert from Lake Mistassini, Mistassini quartzite I should say, excuse me. And that comes from Cree territory in northern Quebec. We've also found some Pennsylvanian chert, which is a greenish color, from Pennsylvania. We've also found Bois des Blancs from Quebec City area. So it's showing that trade materials have been moving through this area from far away. But most of the material we find is quartz. And the other thing we found, and that end scraper I showed you earlier, is the chert, which comes from southern Ontario and northwestern New York State. It's called Onondaga chert. And we found about 1,000 pieces in the lower site. And in this upper site, we seem to find more chert than quartz so far. So I would say we're finding about 200 pieces of chert and maybe 150 pieces of quartz. So it seems to be a different percentage here. What it means, I'm not sure. And so they use these stones for a variety of purposes, to make arrowheads, to make scrapers, to make knives, or just to make things that they liked having because they just liked the look of it. We're just not sure entirely what they may have thought about it. Well, these were archaic people, so these are people that were probably doing you know, a lot of woodworking, hence the need for the scrapers and the burins. They were processing a lot of animal skins, doing a lot of hunting. They were hunter-gatherers, meaning that they probably moved around a seasonal cycle, so they'd follow the river, do fishing in the summer, move inland in the winter, and probably settle different areas depending on the type of season. We don't know, again, like I say, they're not affiliated with any historically or more modern known cultural groups. So for example, I wouldn't say that they were Algonquian or Iroquoian. We don't know. We just call them the archaic peoples, because when you go that far back, you're not sure what the culture was. What language they spoke, we're not sure. Really, our knowledge of their cultural practices are very limited. Under the Heritage Act, I'm responsible for all the artifacts. I hold them in trust for the people of Ontario. Now, if I can find the appropriate First Nation with the appropriate storage facilities, or a museum, or a combination of both, in speaking with the First Nation and with the appropriate museum, they can request to have transfer of that material to that museum to then hold in trust for the people of Ontario. But until that happens, I'm required to hold them by law, protect them, and keep them. The reason I'd like to bring them to a museum or to an appropriate First Nation is that, you know, they're not my artifacts. They're Ontario's artifacts, and I want them so that other people, because keeping information hidden is not what I want to do. I want to publish on this, but I also want other people to be able to see the artifacts. And again, because this is Aboriginal people's culture, I like to give back, hopefully give back that culture so that they can see it as well.
These two are very good in finding stuff.
Yeah?
And that's not a joke, yeah.
Well, we get paid more if we find stuff. So. Yeah.
And that's on the record.
Yeah. Ramsey's been doing this with Paul
3
for
years, right?
3 years?
Yeah.
3 years.
Okay.
And I was shanghaied into this a year ago.
So you work for Paul?
We do.
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah.
I have had 2 seasons of experience in the Middle East, and then a season in Italy, and then I started doing this a year ago. So my background, I would suppose, is biblical archaeology, and that's what I'll be studying for my next degree.
Okay.
And I'm studying anthropology at the University of Ottawa. And 3 years ago I started doing this type of work, and I worked for 3 companies in the Ottawa area. And I'll start a Master's of Archaeology probably the year after next, but where to be determined.
My husband and I are here as volunteers.
Okay. How did you hear about it?
David heard on the radio, and no, actually through the Carlton, through a paper.
Do you have any? Not that you have to, but do you have any experience doing archaeology?
No,
No?
but we travel enormously and always like archaeology. So we just come every week, once a week.
Once a week.
Yeah.
Have you ever been on an archaeological dig before?
Not as a volunteer.
No.
Depends how you put that.
Yes.
Yeah. She's been to Knossos.
Been to what?
Knossos on Crete.
Ah.
Oh, I've been lots more places.
Yeah, but that's
right?
the most exciting
Well,
one.
she's been to
isn't it?
70 countries
Yeah.
Wow.
with special permission all the way.
Yeah.
Now they stop.
We're opening up.
Well, typically this type of work can be, sort of boring, finding very little. But this type of site here is sort of, what we would do it for in terms of interest. We're actually finding lots of ancient stuff, and it's obviously very fascinating.